Subramanian, and I'm part of the Daksha Fellowship team. Live Law has partnered with us for this series, and we're very grateful for their support. So our theme for the day is data and the legal profession, where we'll be discussing the relevance. So basically three things, right? The relevance and the role of data and technology in the legal and policy landscape, the trends and sort of evolving career opportunities in these areas, and how to actually go about skilling up. And we have some really interesting and learned people in our panel today, and I'm very happy to introduce our expert speakers. Sahil Dio is co-founder of CPC Analytics, a data-driven consulting firm with offices in Berlin, Strasbourg, and Pune. He's also visiting faculty at Daksha Fellowship, where he'll be teaching a very interesting course on data and decisions. As part of CPC, he has consulted leading private and public sector organizations, including the World Health Organization and the German International Corporation. He's also worked on projects for the European Union and the European Commission. And very interestingly, CPC is also building some real-time database systems along with other international organizations to help key decision makers on COVID policy. Thank you for that, Sahil, and welcome on board. Kriti Trehan is a lawyer turned public policy professional. Her work has principally been focused on regulatory regimes that are evolving in privacy, data protection, platform immunity, next generation networks, and convergence. Kriti joins this discussion in her personal capacity to share her thoughts and learnings in being a lawyer, come public policy enthusiast, India's tech policy space today. Welcome to the panel, Kriti. Matthew Chaco is a founding partner at SpiceRoute Legal. He specializes in cross-border mergers and acquisitions, private equity, and venture capital deals, particularly in the technology sector. Welcome to the conversation, Matthew. And Adya Misra is a technology lawyer with a specific focus on data protection and privacy. An associate at SpiceRoute Legal, she advises companies across India, Southeast Asia, and the United States to implement data protection processes and navigate cross-border privacy aspects. She has a keen interest in the intersections of policy and data and technology and law. Welcome to the panel, Adya, and thank you all very, very much indeed for joining us this evening. Before we actually move into the conversation, just some housekeeping rules. We have muted the audience, so if you have questions, please put it on the Q&A and we'll take it up at the end of the session. So I'd like to start the conversation, contextualizing the virtues of data, data tools and data analytics. And, today data is also one term that's really overused, but also poorly understood, especially data analytics and models and its relevance in policy. And I say this in light of the pandemic, where data tools and models are essentially sort of used in two ways. So one is these models are helping us predict the future, right? And two, it's also helping us understand the current reality of this, unprecedented crisis that's unfolding in front of us. And heads of states have also used these models to make policy decisions, and but they've also responded very differently, if I may. For example, the president of the United States, Trump, just about a week ago wanted to open the economy and evidenced that decision to a model. While on the other hand, if you see Asian countries have gone with models that support lockdowns, and even Germany, whose Chancellor Angela Merkel is a scientist, they've been on the top of their game and were one of the first countries to actually come out with a very clear policy on this. Right? On the other side of this discourse, there are also detractors to these models, because there are assumptions that are being made, and the kind of on the kind of data that is being collected and how this data itself is processed. So there are a lot of questions here. So I think I'll start with Sahil. So Sahil, could you throw some light on all of this, especially on the relevance of data tools, analytics, and models in policy making today?
Thanks a lot, Archana, and thanks to the Daksha Fellowship team for putting this excellent webinar together. So let me begin by, firstly, I would love to say that I am an engineer, I'm not a lawyer, right? So forgive me if I say some rash things that all of you might not agree to. So I would look at data and database tools and break it down into four parts. Right? The first kind of tools are descriptive in nature. So they try to describe the situation from a data perspective. Going on to the second, it's more diagnostic. right? So trying to figure out what's the cause behind what data is telling us. The third being predictive, right? So with all that we know so far, how would the COVID cases increase in the future? And the last being prescriptive, right? So which tries to lay out a course of action based on the earlier three steps, right? So these, I like when we say data tools, I would like to break these into these four categories at the start. So what you said was very interesting as to how, based on one kind of data set that different decision makers have, you brilliantly gave examples of two individuals who could not be more further apart uh, than any other. So they reacted differently based on similar data that they're looking at, right? So I I feel that the discourse around data needs to be qualified by a lot of other qualitative factors, right? Like we should not start believing that data is the magic bullet that can answer all questions that we have. Having said that, the kind of data and the granularity of data that we have now is unprecedented. Right? So the typical four V's of big data. So there is a lot of buzz around it, but what is for certain is the kind of interlinked data sets that we have allow for decisions that were never possible before, right? So let's now come quickly to the COVID-19 pandemic that we are currently facing. So the Director General of the WHO recently said that this is not only a pandemic but also an infodemic, right? So I think the role of data is of utmost importance here, not only for policymakers but also common citizens like us, where we crave to know whether our ward or our area is affected and how many patients do we have if in this area, right? So this for me would be descriptive statistics, right? Just trying to understand what is happening, right? But from there to a current study that we are working on is where we're trying to model partial lockdown scenarios, trying to estimate the gross value output of different districts and see what kind of what kind of lockdown restrictions on districts, what would it mean for the economy, right? So all of this in my head comes under data based policy making, and I think as we go on, this would just gain importance, right? Like the politics of data, etc., is very valid, happens, but that doesn't mean that this as a tool would not gain importance. Thanks.
All right. Thank you for laying out some insights on how data is relevant in policy making. And I think now Kriti, I'll come to you to sort of talk a little bit about, this relationship between technology and policy. Like even with COVID, if you see contact tracing, there are huge debates around the rights and privacy implications of these apps. And even in India, there was a PDP bill, the artificial intelligence strategy paper, and then the e-commerce bill, and all of them in the last 1 year. And it seems like they all converge towards the fact that the relationship between technology, law, and policy is more nuanced than it has ever been in the past. So, being a practitioner in this field, what do you think are some emerging trends and challenges in the technology policy space itself?
Thanks, Archana, and thanks once again to Daksha Fellowship for having me here. Hi, everyone. I think that's an incredibly loaded question, if there ever was one. And I think, broadly speaking, everybody who's on this discussion would be aware that there are substantive trends in tech policy around privacy, around encryption, around e-commerce, safe harbor, access, etc. It's a very heavy list. So let me just try and break down the tech policy piece itself into three buckets, and look at it from the lens of A, technical, B, social impact, and C, legal. Now, when I say technical, typically when we talk about the technical impacts of policy, we usually talk about how does policy keep up with tech advancements. Although I personally struggle with that portrayal a little bit. Given the nature of technology itself and how fast it moves and how fast it evolves, I'm not sure the characterization of policy keeping up with tech is a fair one. I guess that exactly is what the first challenge is. Instead of keeping up with tech, how do we formulate tech policy which is on a principle-based mechanism, as opposed to regulating the technology itself? So the Personal Data Protection Bill is a great example of this, right? Which looks at regulating the end around individual rights and how does an individual make sure that she has access to her data and she has access and rights to that data. As opposed to specific means of processing data. So look at the end as opposed to the means itself. So that's bucket one, which is around technical challenges. The second is the social impact. And that means being mindful of the social impact of policy in tech, but a lot beyond that as well. So I'd actually go a step further and perhaps say, when we're looking at creating technology policy, how do we ensure that there are no unintended social consequences? Let's take the example of digital payments here, right? The goal of making India a cashless economy has obvious advantages, but the fact remains that a majority of population currently is still not on smartphones. And potentially a policy that could be exclusionary or be limited to a segment of society that has smartphones only would not necessarily serve any benefits around a cashless regime, right? So the ability then to conduct transactions through UPI, through text on feature phones is a great example of a policy that was an inclusive one, that looked at the social impact of the policy as well. And we have to remember that the statement that tech is a great democratizer or an equalizer is not a statement that is made in vain. So giving social impact its due importance in policy, to me, is not just a good to have, but it's in fact indispensable. And so then finally we move on to bucket 3, which is on legal challenges, right? Now with tech convergence, law is unable or incapable to effectively operate in silos anymore. Financial regulation, for example, needs to necessarily consider data privacy, physical storage of data, etc. Communications law similarly would need to have a focus on security, on encryption, etc. The existence and the usage of metadata needs to be regulated again in a sector agnostic manner. So any conversation on tech policy can inherently not be extricated from tech law in that sense. And there's a very clear interplay there. And the importance of law in that sense to become more agile in this space cannot be underscored. But perhaps Matthew and Adya will have a lot more insights on the interplay of law and policy itself. So I'm gonna take a pause here.
Thank you very much, Kriti. And I sort of completely concur with you where you say that, it has to be a very principle-based mechanism, and policy keeping up with tech is a little sort of, is a very fast-reached idea. So I think to continue that conversation, I'll come to you, Matthew, can you sort of help us understand some of these effects, of data and of emerging tech on law firms themselves, right? For example, how are the practice areas, the structure and strategy of law firms changing these changing trends? Have client requirements changed over time? So what's really happening in this space?
Matthew, you're on mute.
Matthew?
Can you hear me now?
Absolutely. Very clear.
This is the first time someone's complained that I'm not speaking, but anyway. So I think I was first faced with a client asking me questions on data about 17 years ago. And this came when I was working in a very large law firm. And the general counsel of an outsourcing company, one of India's earliest, obviously, reached out to this firm and said, hey, can someone help me with this, privacy outsourcing issue that I've got? This lady popped up, and many of the partners who should have taken that call were busy or pretended to be busy because that query was just straight out of some other planet, right? And as one of the younger lawyers at that time, and there wasn't this much gray hair, At that time, I was not given a choice. I was told to just go and handle it, right? Went there, fudged. I look back at the kind of nonsense I said at that session, and that was just absolute ridiculous, right? In fact, if anyone in my firm ever were to give that kind of advice, they would, they would immediately come under some element of disciplinary proceedings for lack of intelligence, if not, forget skill, lack of basic, knowledge. But it's changed over the last, and it's changed in huge, significant manners. Over the last 10 years, and sorry, the 10 years before that, there was this argument that privacy is a foreign concept, a Western cultural imposition, that Indians are by nature communal, we share too much, and therefore privacy law, and you can even see that in various high court judgments following Rangarajan in the 90s, where they reject the claim of tortious violation of privacy on the ground that this concept itself does not belong to our culture. And that was the prevailing thought process in a law firm as well. Fast forward now, there's the angle, a very clear acceptance that privacy is something that's very important to us, and that's driven by technology. And along with a heightened awareness of our privacy is the heightened economic value given to data. Right, so immediately it's not just about, hey, am I getting stalked on the internet? It's also about these 50 things, if put together, create money for the people who can put it together. So how can I come up with processes and systems to put this together in a manner that is respectful of the rights of the people whom I'm observing, right? It's rapidly changed the law firm, and it's changed the law firm in many ways. I think, and we're a small law firm, we're about 40 odd lawyers. We have 5 technologists in the firm, right? Who are looking not at external data, but are looking at internal data on how to improve our processes. I'm guessing Sahil should be the right one to talk about that. But even within our processes, in terms of, say, when Adya on a monthly basis opens her computer, she's got a dashboard by which she can measure her efficiencies, right? So the firm internally has changed, right? It's even changed in the way practice areas are grouped together. So I think if you talk to many of our peer firms, they'll say, oh, we do data, our technology team does data. Right? So there is this large idea that data is a subset of data lawyers are a subset of technology lawyers. I don't see the connection. Yes, data has a close analysis and a close relationship with technology, but it's equally important with employment lawyers. It's equally important with M&A lawyers. It's equally important with regulatory. I mean, it's more important with regulatory lawyers. It's extremely important with the policy wonks like Rithi. It's extremely important with capital markets lawyers. If you are going to function in a law firm externally, you need data. So we start practicing information law practice, right? Because that is what this is all about. Efficiencies within the law firm. Right, so we also try to look at from our website, do people come in from Google or do they come in from LinkedIn? Right? Do we need a presence on Facebook? Do we need a presence on Instagram? Am I able to hire people better if I have some of the associates dance talk? The other overarching theme that law, technology, and data brings up is that none of my data clients are jurisdictional. There is no Indian company. Okay, there are very few companies who've collected vast amounts of data, who've built a business that is India specific. Most of the things that they have learned can be transplanted into multiple jurisdictions. Hence, there is a demand on me to have cross-jurisdictional competence, to be able to work with multiple cultures, to be able to give preliminary advice without having to rely on English, Japanese, German, Chinese, Vietnamese, Indonesian lawyers, and to be able to do large level, macro level risk analysis, data risk analysis as part of a acquisition, right? So we're no longer court going lawyers in Tisasari anymore. We are now fairly active cogs in law and policy, law and technology, law and business at a global scale. And that's, to me, that's changed everything from law and policy, because even if you look at the PDPB, the debates are, while the debates are Indian, all the actors in the debate are not necessarily Indian. It affects an American multinational dealing in data in India. It affects an English health company doing clinical research in India. And it affects that Indian lawyer who's trying to figure out where the English clinical research company's questions are coming from. And these were hypotheticals in early 2000s. We used to read the Harvard Oncomouse decision and say, wow, this is only happened in America. These are all questions which Adya and I faced in the last month, right? How do we, what kind of protections? Do we need ICMR approval before we transfer genome data? Just genome data, not genome, right? Genome data from India to Europe. And honestly, Krithia, you can disagree if you want. I don't think our law has quite answered that question yet. Because as a private practice lawyer, I'd say, hey, go to ICMR and get your approvals. But strictly, if I was arguing in court, I would say it's not written in the law. And with that, shall I stop taking everybody's time? I hope that was
right. No, that was definitely very interesting. And I think I'm just going to pick on that one point where you mentioned, about having to process large volumes of data and, data analytics tools, and a lot of these technology tools also making inroads into the law firms, right? And I think so could you talk a little bit about legal technology? I mean, I understand that it's not an area of expertise as much as it's an industry vertical. But it would be interesting to hear from you on how these developments in the legal tech industry has sort of impacted on the legal profession itself.
Sure, thanks, Archana. So when you're talking about legal tech tools, and I think both Sahil and Matthew kind of touched upon them, yeah. I would categorize them into different buckets based on the purpose they serve. So you've got ERP tools and you've got admin tools that kind of help internal efficiencies. And while they might provide you analysis and analytics and insights, those are strictly from, say, an efficiency analysis, or to how and they help management and administrators kind of better processes, right? You can figure out what clients are useful, whether your resources are using time wisely, etc. So that's one bucket of it. Then there's the second bucket, which actually helps lawyers and associates. I'm speaking strictly from a law firm perspective, where you've got your knowledge tools. You've got things like practical law, you've got Manupatra, you've got Westlaw, you've got tools that actually help with knowledge betterment. So that's one bit of it. And then I think you've got the tools that when people typically talk about legal tech, and that's what they're referring to, which is the automation bit of it. Or, tools that on some level you can see replacing the work that the grunt work that lawyers do. And I think that's where that's where most of the discourse lies when you're talking about legal, the legal automation tools. But I think it becomes crucial to also recognize the fact that tools like practical law, tools like Manupatra have pretty much changed how lawyers approach law, right? Like you've got at the tip of your fingertips a database of information that, absolutely. But to kind of filter through that, you would still, it's just a tool at the end of the day. It's just helping you kind of better up your processes. When it comes to automation, personally, we have tried out some tools at Office. We have looked at tools that offer document templates, or tools that once you plug in certain data, they help you create documents humans. Personally, I haven't found those useful at all. I don't know if it's a sophistication level. I think internationally there's far more luck, and I understand a lot of the international firms have used tools like this. But I personally find that, at least in the Indian context, and I've spoken to a bunch of people across law firms here, I don't think most people have had too much luck with automation tools. So I understand the spirit of kind of improving processes to remove the grunt work. So when you, as a lawyer, you're actually providing value when it just comes to your insights. I would think that the Indian market, and this is of course just a personal view, I still think we're about 10 years away from it actually being useful, that level of sophistication that you need. Because yeah, I don't see how it could replace lawyers right now very efficiently.
Awesome. Thank you, Adya, for that. I think the one point that you made, which is very, very interesting, was how more than the tools that are useful, it's very essential to know the tools, legal tech tools that are really not useful. So with that, I think we've sort of definitely contextualized the relevance of data and policy making. Kriti has spoken about some challenges the tech policy space, and I think Adya and Matthew have sort of definitely put all of this together and spoken a little bit on how this is impacting on the law practice itself. So I think we should start talking a little bit also about the opportunities in this area and the ways to skill up. So again, I'll come back to you, Sahil. So you're working at this intersection of data analytics and policy, right? So could you talk really about this, about how data is used in law firms? And I think Matthew also alluded to that point earlier. And also, most importantly, why the knowledge of data tools is relevant for policymakers today.
Okay, thanks. So I again, I think that there are three aspects to how data is and can be used, right? So before going into that, just one disclaimer: I have no experience of how data is used within law firms, right? So I could only speak about so far I've not worked in a law firm. Maybe if Matthew or someone gives me a job, but other than that,
look how uselessly inefficient we law firms are.
So yeah, so the first aspect that I think each policymaker, and in my opinion a lawyer also needs, is the ability to think about data, right? So when we say data, there is nothing objective about the use of data, right? So though the word used is data science, I think there's also an art or a creative aspect to thinking and using data, right? So just the ability to think of data is a great ability in itself, right? So that's I would say the first part. The second part is then the ability to interpret data, right? So these days, everyone, I remember these Dettol kind of ads on television that suddenly jumped from 99% to 99.9%. So everyone's is using numbers the way they wish to. So the ability to interpret these numbers and also contextualize these numbers is a very important ability, right? So when a prominent public policy professional says that our cases double in 7 days and not 5 days, what does it exactly mean, right? So that ability to interpret these numbers is a very crucial ability. And going on, the third aspect is the ability to process data, right? So the first two aspects don't need any hands-on skills, so as to say, but the third ability is trying to actually understand and use tools and techniques to convert data into insights, right? So insights is again the buzzword, which is a little fancier, like it's refined oil, not crude oil, which data is. So that ability is processing data, right? So maybe not everyone needs that, but I feel if all of us have gone through the grind of processing data, we know the intricacies of what it actually takes and what is feasible and not what not, right? Because a lot of the legal and the political discourses that I hear around data, me as an engineer, I just feel that I would love if that is feasible, right? Like it might be feasible in 10 years, but as of now, the confidence in which certain lawyers and policymakers speak about technology, I myself am amazed as to which vendor manages to do this for them, right? So that's the third ability, right? So I feel each of us, especially in law and public policy, would benefit from having these different abilities. And we as so we are a 6.5-year-old policy consulting firm, and our claim to fame has been using data, right? So when we started off in 2014, data analytics was relatively new, right? And especially new in the context of social science. So I think it's still not late to learn these skills, right? Because just to the last thing I would want to say is, like, I think we would soon move from data privacy, data protection to regulation around algorithms, right? So we are probably already there in certain countries where if you have a multi-layered model, you might not use any protected variable about the individual, but you might be proxying that variable or creating a proxy or intermediate layer which closely correlates to the protected variable, right? So these questions would be of immense legal relevance as well. And we as a firm working in the policy space have already started working in algorithmic fate, as it's called. So fairness, accountability, trust, and explainability. So I think that's where data and law might move, but the other lawyers might have more to say. Thanks.
Thank you, Sahil. So I think it's definitely sort of relevant where you say that, you know, the knowledge of data itself, especially for people in decision-making roles, especially when you're making decisions for the broader public, it always, you know, is very useful to see, to have as much information as possible before you actually try and make a decision. But also, I mean, some knowledge of data science also helps you see through the other side of the fence, especially when it comes to, you know, policy making. And even with COVID, as I mentioned earlier about how heads of states have made decisions, I think you know, data science knowledge is very, very relevant. So I think now that we have sort of discussed about that, Kriti, I have a question for you. So the more we look at what's happening today, right, the more it also feels like the data and technology regime is really going to change the way we live our lives, even perhaps the way, like you earlier mentioned, you know, the way social contract works. So what are some evolving opportunities for lawyers in this space? What are some possibilities here? Like, for instance, if there's someone really interested in the technology space, where should she start?
I mean, if I had to sum it up in one sentence, and I'm sure the rest of the panel agrees, I think it's opportunities abound at the moment. Some of the buzzwords like privacy, access, data security, artificial intelligence, machine learning, smart cities, etc. These are much more than terms that we just throw around to have a coffee table conversation, right? These are signs of true convergence of practice areas, of sectors, of industries. So in that case, in a very large sense, it's very fair to say that tech policy broadly is sector agnostic. Whether we're thinking communications or pharma or finance, entertainment, retail, real estate, name it, and there is a very clear opportunity for engagement. Matthew, in that sense, was completely correct when he said data is valid not just for your tech law practice, but then also for your employment law practice or your pharma law practice, etc. Right? So, for instance, servicing a medical devices client now requires that we very clearly understand data protection standards for medical data of individuals. What is the scope of anonymization? How long can I store that data for example, right? Similarly, to add value to a real estate client, we would be very well served if we were able to give them advice on how and on what basis can they provide access, internet access to residents of a particular society. This basically means that professional opportunities now exist across the board, whether it is law firms, in-house, think tanks, consultancies, civil society, academia, the government, you name it, and it's there. So really the world is our oyster. Or if I had to be a little more topical, I'd just say, take the red pill and enter the matrix, right? But then where to begin, I think, is a fantastic question as well. And to me, this immense overlap, this convergence is the most visible attribute of tech policy. And then what do I mean by this? This overlap is not just the sectoral or the industrial overlap. It's the fact that as a professional in this space, the relevance of understanding the technology, the business, the underlying economics, the overarching social impact, and then obviously the regulatory approach is unparalleled. So knowing and understanding basic legal concepts and basic legal principles is good, but then to be a great public policy professional, personally, I would urge a more generalist, a more holistic understanding of the world that we live in. And then resources available, of course, are aplenty, especially thanks to the fact that global regimes around technology generally are evolving in tandem across the board. And by that, I don't mean in terms of timelines, things are happening together, but I mean that it's just happening at different stages and different phases across jurisdictions. So think of a question in India right now that we might be debating. Turn on your Google search engine and you'll realize that in some jurisdiction or the other, that exact debate has already been had. And there's been some discussion around it that's happened. The discourse, for example, around privacy and data protection, again, is a great example here. The Personal Data Protection Bill draws significantly from regulations across other jurisdictions. So if we're in a situation where we understand what the EU GDPR says, we'll be more than capable of applying those principles within the Indian context as well. If we study papers on big data and the economics of it, or the social impact of digital payments, we equip ourselves in that sense to become stronger, more well-rounded voices in tech policy. So to me, I think educating ourselves in a subject, sector, jurisdiction agnostic manner is key. And I know this sounds like a lot, but honestly, this is exactly where the excitement is.
Thank you, Kriti. I'm definitely, that was a brilliant answer, and I'm definitely sure that a lot of young lawyers and students trying to get into tech policy, this answer is definitely going to help them. And I think I'm coming back to Matthew here again. So Matthew, we definitely know that technology is, replaced jobs in manufacturing and retail. But as you and Adya sort of earlier spoke about how the legal profession itself is transforming, I was also thinking of this one opinion piece a while ago about, on a legal research platform based on IBM's cognitive computing system, Watson, and how it's sort of being used by some of the world's biggest law firms for legal research. So while, I understand that it's a bit of a stretch or even sort of a romantic notion to say that machine learning based tools will replace all the jobs in law firms of the future. And Adya also made the same point earlier. But it's very clear also that there are two things that are happening here, right? So one, firms are really adapting to these tools. And two, there are also new opportunities building up in this space. So Matthew, with all this disruptive innovation that's happening around us, how can individual lawyers really remain relevant?
Right. So I have the opposite take on that, right? I think and I think if you speak to the vast majority of lawyers in law firms, they'd probably say that, oh, these technology costs increase our external costs so much that it's impossible for individual lawyers to compete. And in the short term, that may be true. But if you look at any technology, automotives, refrigeration, air conditioning, the wheel, there's always been a curve where costs have increased. And at some stage, that technology becomes commoditized and available to all. So I think what we're going to see in the next 10 to 15 years is that all these, IBM, Ross, type technology from a cloud platform delivered remotely, data agnostic, without a server based in the US, without an engine based in the US, with engines probably based in every country in the world, will suddenly start operating with far more sophistication than Skadden's infrastructure architecture right now. And therefore, lawyers in the gig economy will be able to plug in, pay a little bit of money for that use, very small amounts, like you use Paytm and you pay 1% to Paytm, right? You'll be paying a very small amount for the use of that technology platform. You'll be using it, and then you'll be generating the necessary infrastructural requirements that are right now only possible in a law firm, right? So rather than technology being being kind of reinforcing the law firm moat, right, or the monopoly, I think what we're going to see is technology break open those doors, make it easy for any lawyer, because no longer is your knowledge of cases relevant. It already isn't, right? That's something technology is already done. No longer is your knowledge of regulations relevant. That's also something with Manupatra and Google, we've got that down pat. The next step will be no longer is your 40 years of experience relevant, because a combination of data plus knowledge will render a 70-year-old lawyer and a 17 or a 25-year-old lawyer able to exercise judgment and skill in the same way. And therefore, to use to misquote a pop fiction author, it will just be the question of how well you can dance, right? Technology and data is going to be an absolutely fabulous leveler. Thankfully, probably not in my generation, but watch out for it, Adya, and everyone else who follows suit.
All right, thank you, Matthew. I'm actually going to continue that conversation with Adya as well. So to take it forward from that, Matthew's answer itself, Adya. So you've been, in data practice, or as Matthew alluded to earlier, it's information law practice, right? In 3 years at SpiceRoute Legal. So what are some skills that you picked up in the last 3 years, and some skills that are actually essential, which you think are essential to be a practitioner in this information law area?
Thanks, Archana. So I think Kriti touched upon this and kind of handled some aspects of this question really well. But I think it comes down to the fact that it's evolving so rapidly, right? There's no single textbook or resource that you can go back to. So I think a lot of it comes down to being very, very, very aware of ongoing developments. The advantage is that there's no shortage of resources, right? There's no shortage of people speaking about this. Like Kriti pointed out, there's enough of multi-jurisdictional talk going on about developments. So in the data sector alone, or the information technology sector alone, it's not just Europe. There are, really exciting things happening in California, in Australia, even in Pakistan, there's a new data protection bill. So I'm just saying that a lot of this is happening simultaneously, and there are enough people speaking about it, right? So I think it's a matter of keeping abreast of all the chatter that's going on, and kind of implementing that and analyzing that chatter to see how it fits in within the Indian context. So I think the first step is making sure you're informed, you're kept abreast of everything that's going on, because it's a rapidly developing space. The second thing, and I think it's almost like a polar opposite of what I said, is that even in the data sector, the foundations are built on constitutional principles. So along with keeping up with the chatter, it becomes very important to make sure you've got a base understanding of the law, right? You need to have a base understanding of these principles as well. So you kind of put 1 and 2 together, it's great. Your insights will be very, very useful, to help companies or to help people, or even it's not just lawyers within the private practice, it's also policymakers. I think this goes hand in hand. Anybody looking to explore these sectors in general, it's a matter of keeping up with the chatter and making sure your bases are very, very powerful. And together, I think it's quite a deadly combination. And I also, yeah, so I'd say it's a combination.
Thanks for that, Adya. And it's also really nice to have three women in this panel. So I think it's also about time to ask Kriti a little bit about her own experience, right? She has worked as a lawyer with the UN before, and then she moved into the tech policy space. So Kriti, how has this landscape changed since time you entered the space? And the other question also that I'd like to ask is, all said and done, men are the hem, at most of these technology companies. But interestingly, tech policy space itself, especially in India, isn't that bad at all, and has really brilliant women like yourself who are sort of actively participating in this space and practicing this new emerging area. Right. With all of that, we're also particularly interested to hear about how easy or difficult it is to make a mark in this field as a woman.
Wow, so you made me sound incredibly old, Archana. Thank you so much.
Oh no, I'm so sorry.
But to be absolutely fair, I think tech policy as a subject is far more dynamic than a lot of its parallels in other sectors, and therefore the growth curve in this profession is incredibly steep. We've, of course, I mean, ever since I started practicing this, we've gone from a debate on regulation and licensing to soft touch models to rights-based approaches, etc. Right, and all of that is quite evident. So let me not delve into that. Let me actually address your second question, which is on being a woman in tech policy. I remember early days, and yes, now I'm making me sound old. I'm honestly not that ancient. But no, on a serious note, I remember the times when I would walk into a room with a cross section of stakeholders, and I was aghast by how few women those rooms had. I've been in meetings where I found myself not being recognized to speak, while other colleagues were never short of openings. I've also, unfortunately, been in situations where I've made what I believed was like an earth-shattering or important point, only to have a colleague repackage, repurpose it as their own. And I've been in meetings where I've entered, gotten overwhelmed, and thought to myself that I honestly don't belong. Now, to the entire audience here, and even to the panel, how many of you, if you're thinking about this really honestly, were picturing me against a male-dominated setting? Can I just see a show of hands, if possible? From the panel, at the very least. Right now, I asked a very similar question earlier last year in Jamaica, and honestly, the answer was 100%. And that's not an exaggeration. The tech profession in India, if numbers are to be believed, has only about 26 to 34% of women in engineering and other roles. And that gap only widens as we go up the pyramid of seniority. Law, on the other hand, actually starts off as being a lot more equal. Although again, that gap widens as we go up that ladder of experience. And that to me is honestly the most unfortunate and sad part of things, right? But I see that I've painted quite the gloomy picture. And I definitely should therefore now talk about a little bit of a ray of sunshiny hope that I also see. Between then and now, and since we've already established I am as old as an Egyptian mummy, I'm just going to lean into it. But between then and now, I've seen a sharp rise in non-male voices. I've seen panels being a lot more aware of the importance of women at the table, this being a brilliant example of that as well. I feel incredibly proud when I say that my team at work currently is actually over 50% female. I find myself as being part of WhatsApp messages, chain emails, and social professional circles that are focused on women in technology. And so I find myself being quite encouraged, right? Like, look at this discussion today. I was just scrolling over the list of participants, and I see an overwhelming female participation. So thank you for allowing me to be part of this optimism. And can I just say, I look forward to welcoming all of you, both women and allies, into the profession.
Thank you, Kriti. That was really inspiring. And So I think we should also talk a little bit about, hiring in law firms. Matthew, so it's a very straightforward question, right? So what do you look for in a candidate when you hire for the firm?
So we actually have in this, probably Sahil I should talk to him whether he can help us with it. We've actually got different kinds of very data-driven approaches to hiring, right? Firstly, there are some base requirements. If you don't know the Constitution, I'm sorry, you can know all the tech law you want, but it just won't work, at least not at SpiceRoute, right? You can be a super whiz at the difference between equity shares and preference shares, still not gonna work if you don't know the Constitution. Similarly, if you don't know your Contract Act inside out, regardless of practice area, you will not be able to make it. Similarly, basic principles of transfer of property, can't do without. Basic principles of interpretation of statutes, can't do without. Unfortunately, given our Anglican bias, a superb grasp over English, again, cannot do without. It's unfortunate, but the business of law is entirely transacted in English. I am hopeful that it will change, but right now I don't see it happening. In fact, Riti, do you want to interrupt and tell me, do you ever work with lawyers who can't speak English?
That's a great question. No, I don't believe I have.
Right? And that's yeah, and that's a big problem with, I mean, along with the obvious other biases that we have in the law, we've got to play along with this one. So those are the basic skill sets that you need, and of course an additional skill set on how to do legal research, right? If you're unable to, I mean, the days of being able to just do a simple Google search and a Manupatra search and get away with it is no longer relevant. We're looking at very sharpened skills on how to use information technology to get very pointed results in legal search, right? Again, these are things which you can very easily pick up in 5 or 3 years of law school. If you haven't, the question we ask is, why haven't you? Is there a problem with your ability to improve yourself, right? That's one step of questioning, and those are the base skills, right? After that, we've got a set of practice area specific skills. You must know your civil procedure code if you want to do disputes. If you want to do disputes in Karnataka, for example, we prefer people who speak Kannada. If you want to do disputes in Delhi, we prefer people who speak Hindi. If you don't, then, for obvious reasons, we don't hire. For data and tech, in addition to all these bundles of attributes we particularly look for people who can think out of the box, right? Frequently, when someone asks you, can I transfer genome data? You're going to come back to me and say, there's nothing in the statute and I don't know what to do. The client has very little use for you, right? Similarly, if someone comes and says, do I need to mask some data before I transfer it out of the country? Or do I need to anonymize it? And what is the difference? And you come and say, you know what, the difference is technical, and as a lawyer, it doesn't help. Figure out the difference between masking and anonymization. Figure out get involved in the debate of whether anonymization is actually a technical possibility or is it impossible to effectively anonymize. Look at that silly PDPP bill and see how they've gotten it wrong in the definition of anonymization. Get involved. We'd want people who can do that, right? If we don't want people who say, yes, sir, Matthew, yes, sir, you're right, your bald head is shining, or any variations thereof, right? We're really looking at trying to identify people who will work really hard, identify the issue, take a position, stand their ground, argue it out, regardless of whether the Buddha who's arguing against you is 50, 60, 70, etc. If you can't do that, man, woman, whatever other gender, you're not going to be able to stand up for yourself in life or in law. And we're looking at, I mean, while we don't particularly take a personal view on whether what you do in your life, we are looking at people who can stand up for what you believe in terms of the law and in terms of your legal ethic to protect and represent and advise your client.
Absolutely.
So
That was a
very frequently, the mooters, the debaters, the long paper writers end up catching our attention because they exhibit the base skills that can very easily be molded into standing up for what you believe in and taking a call on positions of law. But you
Absolutely.
really ask that same question because I'm presuming she's hiring as well for her team.
I think we just have another 5 to 10 minutes, and then we'll take questions, Matthew, of course. Kriti, do you have anything to add to this? And Sahil as well.
I think Matthew's actually hit the nail on the head when he says it's a very, and I alluded to this, right? It's a very holistic approach that we're looking for in an individual that we're looking to hire. And so in my older avatars at law firms, when I've conducted hiring, I've been surprised, shocked, and disappointed at the fact that basics for students tend to be a very itchy slope. A lot of times you'll ask them basic constitutional questions. It's something that students tend to struggle with a lot. I don't know if this is an education system issue. I don't know if this is an interest issue, but I know for a fact it is an issue. So if there's one piece of advice that folks from this webinar are going to take away, it is brush up your basics and get those right. Once you have your basics right, everything else can be added on as an additional skill. But if your basics are not there, it's going to be very difficult for you to clear that first year itself.
No, I think that's definitely relevant. And Sahil, do you have anything to add to this point on hiring for law? They're talking from the point of law firms and tech policy. But do you have? Are there any measures on how you sort of hire for CPC?
So, like again, I would agree with all that is said in context with public policy and not law. But I would again like to stress what Matthew said about Karnataka and Delhi. Like I think English is definitely essential, but in India, in the public policy context, knowledge of regional languages, given the federal nature of our country, is very crucial, right? Like even with COVID-19. The data released by the state government of Maharashtra every evening is in Marathi. Right? So it's the reality, and I think so we work a lot with European governments as well, and stuff happens purely in their language. Right? So I think languages matter. That's one thing. The second thing is, funnily, we have this divide of like data, maths on one hand, and social sciences on the other. So like initiatives such as the Daksha Fellowship try to bridge this, which is excellent. But I think we really look out for that. Right? Like most of us have one degree in like hard sciences or applied sciences or technology, and another in some kind of social science discipline, right? So that combination, I think, is really crucial as we go on. So that's what we look for. Thanks.
All right, thank you, Sahil. I think the one point that's coming out very clearly is that disciplinary knowledge, of course, is very important, but other skills, it's like communication, critical thinking, and holding an argument, and also having an ethical view around all of this definitely seems to be, very important when it comes to hiring. Now that we've spoken about hiring, I think, Adya, could you come in a little bit and talk about your experience in a law school, right? What do you think about the curriculum itself? Is there something that should be really changing, and in what way should it be changing?
So firstly, I think Matthew, Kriti, and Sahil's standards can be a little, I think it can be a little scary for the graduates listening to it. Because I also think that a lot of this comes down to hoping that students are individually motivated to make sure that, they possess these skills. And very honestly, I don't think most law school systems allow students to kind of to rise to that kind of occasion. So I understand that while everybody else's standards are very dependent on individuals themselves being motivated, I think where law schools can help is design systems that actually allow students to reach this level. Like, this is the base level, right, that you need to kind of enter the profession. So systems need to be designed like that. I think Kriti was mentioning that it was an issue. She wasn't sure if it was an education issue, or if it was an education system issue, or if it was an interest issue. I think about 70% of the time it's an education system issue. I don't think the courses are designed in a way to allow students to fully explore these interest areas in college. I think apart from the foundations, which become very important, it's important for colleges and law schools to, I think, also put together courses or classes or seminars on things like critical thinking or logical reasoning or negotiations. Because regardless of the field of law you get into, this seems to be the unifying factor. You need to be able to think critically. You need to be able to question. You need to be able to reason. I don't think, and this is just my experience at law school, I don't think the systems are designed to allow students to explore that in great detail. So I think while it's important for students to individually try to cultivate it, the onus should also be shifted onto law schools to design systems that allow students to explore this in greater detail. So that might mean in spaces like technology, for example, to relook at your curriculum not once a year, but maybe twice a year, right? Because that's how quickly the system is rapidly evolving. But colleges and law schools need to have the systems in place to constantly relook at their curriculums as well, to allow students to kind of keep up with the pace at which the industries are progressing.
Thank you, Adya. And this is something that we agree at Daksha Fellowship as well.
Yeah.
We agree that it should be very holistic as opposed to, just focusing on disciplinary silos, as we like to call it. And with that, I think I have one last question for Sahil, and then we'll take questions. So Sahil, you're visiting faculty at Daksha Fellowship, and you're going to be taking the data and decisions course. Could you talk a little bit about your engagement with us and what you envision for the course?
Yeah, so I'm extremely excited about this. I think it's probably one of the first times such a course would be conducted for lawyers in India. And like, even outside law, I know that a lot of social science professions struggle with using data, right? So it's a great initiative that Daksha Fellowship has decided to include this as a core course in the longer duration of the fellowship. Having said that, I think quickly, like, we're going to cover everything that everyone's spoken of here. So thanks a lot for saying all those things. Our focus is going to be again on these three things. So I'm reiterating. So the ability to think about data, ability to interpret data, and then the ability to process data, right? So it might be the case that most of the fellows would not have used much Excel or even R in the past, but the attempt would be to actually use real data sets and get them to make sense of that data, right? Just to understand how it's done and what can be done and what cannot be done, right? Because as I think Adya said once about it's important to know what legal tech tools cannot do. It's also important to understand what data cannot do, right? And all the underlying assumptions that exist in the different models that are made. So I think these three aspects would be covered in the course with a lot of real data sets and real problems that we work on, or other policy professionals work on using data, right? So along with all of this, there would be an emphasis on understanding the politics of data, right? Trying to see how some indicators support certain arguments, right? So one important question that I tend to ask everyone is, if they were the head of a particular nation, what indicator would they use to quantify that nation, right? Would it be, and if you just have one indicator, it's a struggle, right? You can either choose GDP growth, or you could choose the Gini coefficient, or you could choose the happiness index, whatever that is. So such things, I think, challenge each of us to think and then sharpen all our thoughts based on data, right? So that would be the focus of this course at Daksha. So I would encourage all of you to apply and then hopefully attend this course. Thanks.
Thank you, Sahil. We are also really looking forward to the course, to the data and decisions course. And thank you really very, very much, Kriti, Matthew, Sahil, and Adya. It was super beautiful to listen to all of you. There were so many insights, so many thoughts, and so much I'm sure that there is for us to take away from all of this, from this conversation. And before we close, we do have questions. We do have a lot of questions that we've received. But before we take questions, I just wanted to also remind you that Round 2 of Daksha Fellowship is closing soon. So if you've started your application, now is the time to finish. And if you're interested in the fellowship, now is the time to start and finish the application. Our inaugural cohort will receive 100% tuition waiver, so please do apply. And for more information, you can visit our website at dakshafellowship.org. And we're also on social media, so do follow us to receive updates from us. And we will move to the questions. So there's one question from an anonymous attendee. Does present data protection laws in India really confirm with the right to privacy? Matthew or Adya? Sorry, Matthew or Kriti, and even Adya.
Sorry, could you repeat that, Archana? I apologize.
Absolutely. So does present data protection, so basically the question is to try and understand if the data protection sort of, I think he's alluding to the PDP bill. So he's asking if that sort of confirms with the right to privacy.
It really depends on how you conceptualize the right to privacy. I think I would look at data protection as something that is very closely related to the right to privacy. It does not encompass it. In some ways flows out of it, in some ways may not necessarily flow out of it, but it's two sides of a three-sided coin, right? You should look at it independently as well as together. You can't understand data protection without understanding privacy. But privacy is to me, it's a much wider, larger concept, including constitutional privacy, including tortious actions of privacy, and of course, what we do with personally identifiable information in the context of commerce, economics, etc.
Thank you, Matthew. And there's another question from Kaif Siddiqui. So his question is, individual-based policies, are they feasible in the present corporate surveillance / advertising databases scenario? I'm not sure that question is very, very clear. Is it? I think the question is not very clear to us. So if you can just sort of elaborate on that question, that will be very helpful. Moving to the next one, where there's one from another anonymous attendee. Do you think culture is bigger than Constitution of India? I think that's the question.
I think he needs to take this one.
Sorry, what did you say, Matthew?
I said you or Adya need to take this one. I'm not.
No, I'm happy to have Adya chime in on this, but I think the question itself also includes that the constitution is the supreme law of the land, and that there's nothing above that. And you're absolutely right. The constitution of the India is the constitution of India is the backbone of all regulation and our existence. So I would definitely say that it's the supreme law of the land, and there is nothing bigger than that. I think culture plays a very significant role in day-to-day existence and in day-to-day interpretation of constitutional principles, if that makes sense. But no, the short and honest answer is constitution trumps all. But Adya, did you want to add something to that?
No, perfectly captured.
Thank you. So there's a question from Shekhar. Who is to be held responsible in case of breach of data? Adya, Matthew, Kriti?
Sure.
Adya, do you want to take this?
Yeah, sure.
Not from Morrison, obviously.
No, I'm assuming that you're speaking from a PDPB perspective
Yeah.
and not present Indian law. Under the PDPB, it's the data controller or the data fiduciary. So basically,
Data,
the person,
yeah.
who's in charge of deciding how the data is processed. That's the party that's going to be held liable for a data breach. So even though you might use third-party vendors or service providers, at the end of the day, you're the one held liable if there's a data breach because you're the one responsible for it.
Thank you, Adya. There's another question from Pankaj Jain. Is Arogya Setu app, how secure is Arogya Setu app?
Okay, so Sahil, do you want to go on this? You should know more about this.
Yeah, I get very scared with all of you guys there. No, it's extremely secure, right? It's fast changing, so everything is being recorded. So I think everyone should download it and just use it.
Right. Thank you, Sahil.
If I can just quickly jump in on that, I think it's fair to say that no app is unhackable. No online electronic platform is 120% secure. It's as safe and secure as the processes and the systems that are put in place. So I think a fair question in that sense and also would be, how secure is an app based on the information provided in the privacy policy of the application? What are the practices that have been put in place at the back end? What sort of vulnerability testing? What sort of white hat hacking, etc., is being done at the back end to ensure that the platform is not vulnerable? I think it's a fallacy to say any online platform is completely beyond reproach. The standards of data protection applicable to it, of course, are the ones that sort of help make it less hackable than others. Let's just say that.
Thank you, Kriti. There are 52, oh my God, there are 52 more questions and we have 15 more minutes. We'll try to cover as many questions as possible. So there's one from Ananya. What kind of data interests law firms and how do they analyze it to their advantage?
So all kinds of data interest us. Internal data on efficiency, external data on efficiency, external data on market perception, external data on what the requirements of a client are, external data on what are the requirements of what are the complaints that a client has against their average lawyers, even competitive data around, hey, which law firms clients are most unhappy with them, right?
Right. There's a question from Divit Jain. What are the aspects in the legal profession that are most likely to be automated in the near future? I think that question was also answered by both Matthew and Adya at some point in this conversation. But I think he's also asking that with reference to the area of intellectual property law.
Right. So in terms of IP, automation within the IP legal framework. Have I understood the question correct?
Correct.
Right. So if you look at if you look at Indian systems of filing, processing, preparing intellectual property, a lot of work continues to be manual. A lot of work depends on data on the person drafting the specification, so to speak. A lot of the submissions are manual. A lot of the responses are also manual. However, if you look globally at systems, there are, I think, computers, artificial intelligence that have proved very adept at drafting patent specifications to a 75% to 80% completeness. There are automated systems at filing trademarks and patents. There are automated systems that provide you draft answers to objections that you receive. So I think of all, and because a vast majority of intellectual property prosecution work is amenable to the if then else solution, and i.e. The ability to provide, say, standard answers to standard questions are extremely high. I would assume that in the legal process automation framework, intellectual property would be one of the first attack points for technologists. Sahil, any thoughts on this?
So like I generally, what I feel is the lower end repetitive tasks typically tend to be automated first, right? But as like the curve you mentioned about technology, I think there's a similar curve for automation, right? Like as automation starts happening, our expectation as users from the automation also starts increasing, right? So what satisfied us in the past, we start seeing nuances that the automation lacks, right? But as a young lawyer or a policy professional entering this field, I think that's definitely imperative on them to understand what can be automated and what can't. So I think that's that consideration is important. But I don't see anything being replaced per se. Right? I think it's just I think at the end it's always a human machine combination that tends to work.
Sahil, you have a question from Michelle Khan. So he wants you to elaborate on the point of the shift to regulation of algorithm instead of protection of individual data.
So again, I think the other panelists would whack me on this, but I feel the so like let me give you a few examples, right? So currently for a large German foundation, we are doing a study on the potential of Indo-German AI collaboration, right? So what kind of AI could be developed collaboratively between different countries if we now start thinking of data markets, so as to say, right? So what this then quickly brings us to is thinking of what can actually be done with data, right? It isn't really about the data itself, which I understand privacy and protection to be, but about the use of data. And that's when I come to algorithms, right? So I think few months back, there was an outrage over the use of like a husband and wife got different credit limits on a Apple Pay card in the US, right? So I won't name a firm, but we work for a firm in India, which is a fintech firm that hands out loans via an app. So they like through their customer care, different people of a particular caste have complained that their caste has been discriminated against, right? And from a so there's no law per se against this, but from a reputational risk perspective, they wanted us, or they want like still doing it. So they wanted us to independently assess whether such a discrimination is actually taking place with their algorithm, right? Um, so again, from a law perspective, I think this field is extremely tricky. It's to my mind, it's almost like finance, because like the guys who screw up in finance or say take down a bank, typically they are then called back to run the bad bank because they are the only guys who seem to understand what's going on in the bank, right? So similarly, the person who developed the algorithm, probably he or she is the only person who understands, if at all, right? Because given how easy it is just to download a package from the internet and build an algorithm, maybe even they don't understand what could go wrong. But I feel all of this is extremely exciting, and it's a non-binary space and allows for a lot of different opinions, viewpoints, normative discussions, etc. So I feel that is a field that has already emerged, right? In India, maybe it would soon, but like in Germany, we see that happening a lot.
Can I jump in here, Archana, for a second? Sorry for interrupting. But I just want to pick Adya's and Kriti's brain. And I'm sorry for excluding you from this one, Sahil. But do you think, potentially, and for fun's sake, you could imagine a constitutional lawyer walking into the Supreme Court 50 years down the line and arguing that the machine, armed with X threshold of data, should constitute state for the purposes of Article 12?
Adya, do you want to go first?
And this is my Article 12 analysis is a little shaky, but I do think there are certain. Is it just information that they have? Since we're taking this question, is it just information? Because to the best of my knowledge, you would be required to perform a state function. Right? What is it that this algorithm is doing? If it's just a database of information, I don't see why it would constitute a state for the purposes of Article 12. But I do think that if it's a tool that's being utilized to do something that has an impact on the public or with respect to state functions, I could see, yeah, sure, why not?
I think that's a very fair response. And I think more than what is the quality of information that is being processed, more than that, I think the relevant test would be the performance of state function.
Yeah.
And as long as, I would imagine that if an institution can be seen and can be decided by the judiciary as performing state function by virtue of being as part of the state, I don't see why it's impossible to argue that a machine could be there as well. Will that fly or not is a conversation for a different time, I think, Matthew. But the argument could definitely be made.
Sorry, Archana, I just struck me. I thought it would be fun to ask.
You're on mute.
Yeah. I'm super sorry. Yeah, so I'm going back to the questions here. So I think the one common theme that's emerged in a bunch of questions here is how to really get into information law / technology policy. What are the steps for final year law students? Can I answer this question?
Please.
I think my answer would be to apply for the Daksha Fellowship. We have a very, very beautiful technology policy track, but I'd leave it to the experts to sort of also throw some light on this.
No, I would agree.
Oh, go on, Matthew.
No, Kriti, please.
No, I was just going to say, I think the Daksha policy the fellowship is a great example. And I'm going to go back to my point on the requirement of a holistic understanding, right? So, if I had to go down to brass tacks, I would say go find courses that are available to you to read more about the business of technology, the engineering behind the technology. How do algorithms work? What is the social impact of a certain technology? What are the potential unintended consequences? Just, I would imagine just reading a lot more about that will give you two perspectives. One, whether or not you enjoy the stream, and it'll give you a very realistic idea of what would be expected of you in the profession itself. And two, it'll help equip you a lot better on this. I think, unfortunately, in India, I don't believe there are a lot of master's programs around tech law and policy, but please feel free to correct me if I'm wrong on that. I think there are some very fabulous policy programs that exist across the country, across the world. And just getting that knowledge, getting those skill sets in your kitty would probably be really helpful and would go a long way.
Thank you, Kriti. I think this is the last question that we can take because we're really running out of time. And there's one question from Ameya Naik to Matthew. Going by your answer on what you're looking for, but sounds like a lot of work. But how do you assess this ability? And do you have tools, frameworks, etc., that you would recommend for legal / regulatory / policy risk analysis?
I apologize. My dog wants to participate in this conversation.
You must bring your dog in.
Yeah.
Matthew.
He's a giant monster. But do you want to run that question again, please? I got about half of it, but if you could just quickly summarize.
So yeah, Ameya is basically asking if you can sort of talk a little bit about what kind of tools do you actually use when you actually assess the candidate's ability, and also tools that you would recommend for legal / regulatory / policy risk analysis. And I think the question is also open to others.
Right. So I'm guessing every one of us must have a different take on this, but at the firm, we're a great believer in not using technology tools in our hiring process, right? So we don't have, and when I say technology, I mean even psychoanalysis tools or any of those psychometric tools that people these days use. We are very great believers in the art of the conversation and all that it can reveal. So as long as you are sufficiently obsessed with technology and policy, and you have your 4-5 basics right? Your constitution, your contract, your transfer of property, and if you really want to go for it, your intellectual property. And I'm struggling with people who on the fourth requirement. But as long as you've got the first 3 laws right, and as long as you are sufficiently interested in technology and have been sufficiently interested in technology for a long enough time, our 3-pronged interview process will reveal that to us. The rest is rest is a bit of luck and a bit of social skills, I guess. But we've really designed our interview skills so that our interview processes so that it can't be gamed. So there's no formula, there's nothing to learn, there's nothing to study. We're just looking for interest plus basic legal skills. Does that help, or does that confuse the issue more?
I think that definitely helps. Kriti and Sahil and Adya, do you have anything more to add to Matthew's point?
I think, and I speak from, again, past experience, not my current role, but at least when I was hiring for law firms, there were a couple of additional things I would look at. The first stage was knowledge of law and competence in it. And I think to that end, Matthew's parameters seem fairly familiar to me. So constitution, contract would be the basics that I would look at. And then I think it's also helpful thereafter to to review writing skills and speaking skills for individuals. And I'm not so much focused on the quality of language or how flowery or beautiful you can make it. I think what I'm looking for there is clarity and coherence of thought, fluency of thought, and most importantly, in as few words as possible, can you make the client understand what you're trying to explain to them, instead of making it a very long-winded document. So I think I would, for example, ask them to write an email and give a piece of advice. I would also ask them to do the same thing for a short memo. I would ask them to answer 5 questions on hypothetical scenarios. And I think those are things that help, at least help me understand the skill sets of an individual, 1, and 2, help me figure out that if I were to bring them on board, what are the pieces of work that I would need to then put in to help them become a stronger professional.
Thank you, Kriti. I think we have run out of time. There are more questions, but we'll see how we can get back to the students and the other young law professionals and the questions. So we are at the end of day 2 at the Daksha series. Thank you very, very much, Kriti, Adya, Matthew, and Sahil for joining us today and for really throwing insights on how things happen in law firms, how things happen in the policy space, and how data analytics works. I think it was super insightful, and it was personally for me such a blast to have a conversation with all of you. So thank you really very much. And we have more coming up this week. Tomorrow we have Mahesh Menon from the Daksha Fellowship in conversation with Usha Ramanathan and Prerna Mukharia on the social implications of big data. Registrations are open. Links are on our social media pages. So we hope to see you all tomorrow. So thank you really very much for joining us this evening. Please stay safe and take care of yourself. Good night.
Thanks so much. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks.